They did not slap me in public. Instead, they smiled, pulled my husband out of the frame, and placed my sister's new boyfriend in his spot. Hearing the shutter click, a cold truth hit me. For years, I was never loved, only kept around because I was useful. By turning my husband into their cameraman, they unknowingly handed their family empire to the one person who knew exactly how to bring it down quietly. My name is Vanessa Ashmore, and I have spent 37 years mastering the art of the perfect, silent nod. If you were to stand in the grand foyer of our family home in Greenville, South Carolina, you would immediately understand why. The house is a sprawling, colonial-style fortress of brick and ivy, designed entirely to intimidate people before they even cross the threshold. Tonight, we were gathered under the massive crystal chandelier to celebrate my mother Celeste's 60th birthday. The air inside the foyer was suffocating, heavy with the scent of expensive white gardenias, roasted meats, and the sharp metallic tang of vintage champagne. Everywhere you looked, there were reminders of the Ashmore legacy heavy oil portraits, imported marble floors, and a curated guest list whose combined net worth could keep entire accounting firms busy. I stood near the edge of the room with my husband of 11 years, Evan Mercer. Evan is a man built of quiet strength, decent principles, and unshakable patience. He does not wear bespoke Italian suits or check his watch every 5 minutes to feign importance. He is a high school history teacher and an assistant baseball coach. To the young men he mentors, he is a steady guiding hand. To me, he is the only truly safe harbor I have ever known. But to the Ashmore family, Evan's profession is a polite tragedy. They consider his life too ordinary, utterly devoid of the aggressive, flashy ambition they worship. For over a decade, my mother has treated my husband like a slightly embarrassing accessory that she cannot discard, but absolutely refuses to acknowledge in public. Evan never complains. He just stands by my side, offering me a gentle smile that tells me he knows exactly who they are, and he loves me anyway. The meticulously curated energy in the room shifted entirely when the heavy oak front doors swung open. My younger sister, Sloane Ashmore, has always treated time as a vague suggestion meant only for lesser people. She arrived a full hour late, stepping into the foyer with the dramatic, rehearsed flair of a leading lady walking onto a film set. But Sloane was not the reason my mother nearly dropped her crystal champagne flute. The real spectacle was the man holding my sister's hand. His name was Grant Ellison. I had only heard whispers about him for the past 6 months, but seeing him in person confirmed every exhausting cliché. He was a hotel investment broker, a man who traded in luxury resort developments and aggressive hospitality acquisitions. He wore a navy suit tailored so sharply it looked like it could cut glass. He moved through the crowd with a predatory, calculated grace, armed with a blinding white smile and a firm handshake designed to assess your social value within 3 seconds. My mother, Celeste, practically glided across the marble floor to intercept them. The dignified, aloof matriarch routine vanished instantly. She morphed into a fawning, starstruck hostess. She ignored Sloane almost entirely, latching onto Grant as if he were a long-lost aristocratic heir returning from abroad. She paraded him through the living room, eagerly introducing him to local politicians, cosmetic surgeons, and real estate tycoons. She personally pulled out a tufted leather chair for him at the center of the room. She leaned in, hanging on his every word as he spun arrogant tales about multi-million-dollar beachfront properties and 30% profit margins. She treated him like the ultimate social trophy, a shiny new weapon to wield against her country club rivals. She asked him more questions in 10 minutes than she had asked my husband in 11 years. Evan remained in the background. Earlier that evening, I had watched him quietly help my father carry 2 heavy cases of wine up from the cellar because the caterers were overwhelmed. No one thanked him. No one even noticed. He was doing the real, unglamorous work, while Grant stood by the fireplace, swirling an amber glass of bourbon and taking credit for the air he was breathing. Then came the moment that permanently fractured my reality, the family portrait. I will come back to the exact scene in a moment, because it was worse than one sentence can hold. I was the one who had always fixed their messes behind the scenes. That was the moment I understood I needed to stop protecting them. In my role as Director of Risk Investigation at Blackthorn Risk Advisory, I am paid a substantial salary to see the things other people desperately want to hide. My office sits high above the streets of Charlotte, where I spend 50 to 60 hours a week analyzing corporate structures, searching for the exact point where a foundation is guaranteed to crack. I look for the hidden debts, the inflated assets, the toxic liabilities that executives try to bury under slick presentations. I do this because numbers, unlike people, do not lie. When a company is rotting from the inside out, the signs are always there, written in the margins, waiting for someone willing to look closely enough. It is a bitter irony that the sharp, analytical gaze I used to dismantle multi-million-dollar corporate frauds completely failed me when I looked at my own family. Or perhaps it did not fail me. Perhaps I just chose to close my eyes, because if I applied my professional standards to the Ashmore family dynamic, the red flags would have been visible from space. I am 37 years old, and for most of my life, my official title within the family was never daughter, it was the fixer. Being the eldest in the Ashmore family meant carrying the invisible weight of everything that went wrong. I was the one who achieved top grades, kept my head down, and quietly solved the crises my parents or my sister created, never asking for recognition or applause. When I was 16, I was the one who stayed up until 3 a.m. helping my father reconcile his small business accounts because he was too proud to hire a real accountant. When I was 22, I was the one who quietly drove to a police station 2 towns over to bail my sister out after she crashed her car into a decorative fountain at a country club, ensuring the incident never made the local papers. I did these things without being asked. I mistakenly believed that being reliable would eventually earn me their genuine respect. My younger sister, Sloane, operated under a completely different set of physical laws. If I was the anchor, she was the fireworks display. She could drop out of a prestigious university after 2 semesters, spend $40,000 of my parents' money backpacking through Europe, and return home to a welcome party. My mother would wave away Sloane's reckless behavior with a dismissive flick of her wrist. "She is a free spirit," Celeste would say, pouring another glass of wine for her friends. "She is just finding herself." Sloane was never required to be responsible because her chaos was always wrapped in an undeniable, magnetic charm. She was loud, she was gorgeous, and she knew exactly how to perform the role of the dazzling Ashmore daughter. My mother operates entirely on the currency of perception. She does not care if a house is sinking into the mud. As long as the front door is painted a flawless shade of designer gloss, she has spent 60 years curating an existence meant to be admired from afar. She is drawn to power, loud wealth, and people who can serve as mirrors reflecting her own supposed grandeur. She fundamentally despises the quiet, the steady, and the ordinary. To her, a stable life is a wasted life. This warped value system is the exact reason Evan Mercer never stood a chance. Evan is a man of profound, quiet substance. He does not wear watches that cost more than a car. He does not speak in jargon about market yields, venture capital, or leveraged buyouts. He earns a public school teacher's salary. He spends his afternoons hitting ground balls to teenagers who need a father figure more than they need a coach. When he comes home to our house in the Charlotte suburbs, he leaves his work at the door. He cooks dinner. He walks our massive golden retriever, and he asks me about my day with genuine, undivided attention. Our 11 years of marriage have been a sanctuary. We built a life that is entirely ours, defined by quiet weekend mornings, long drives with no destination, and a deep, unbreakable mutual respect. Evan is my absolute safe harbor. But in the grand theatrical production of my mother's life, Evan is a background extra who wandered onto the stage by mistake. Celeste's disdain for Evan was never loud. It was a slow, agonizing death by 1,000 paper cuts. It was the way she would introduce him at gatherings, her voice dropping a fraction of an octave as she said, "This is Vanessa's husband, Evan. He teaches history." She would deliver the word teaches as if it were a mild terminal illness we were all bravely ignoring. It was the way she would listen to Evan speak for exactly 10 seconds before her eyes would glaze over and she would pivot the conversation towards someone with a more impressive title. The physical evidence of her disrespect was everywhere. Every December, a heavy embossed envelope would arrive in our mailbox in Charlotte. The beautiful calligraphy on the front would read, "To Vanessa Ashmore," completely erasing my husband's existence from my own household. When we visited Greenville, the guest room was always prepared with my favorite flowers and my preferred brand of sparkling water, with absolutely zero consideration for Evan. If he offered to help her in the kitchen, she would wave him away like a minor pest. "No, no, Evan, just go sit down. You would not know where anything goes," she would say, her tone dripping with polite condescension. For 11 years, I swallowed every single one of those insults. I convinced myself that fighting back would make me the villain. I thought that by absorbing the disrespect, I was being the mature adult in the room. I told myself that Evan and I knew the truth about our beautiful life, and that was all that mattered. I thought I was protecting our marriage by building a wall of silence around it. But silence is not a shield. It is an accomplice. Every time I smiled tightly and thanked my mother for a card that excluded my husband, I was validating her behavior. Every time I changed the subject when someone made a thinly veiled joke about Evan's income, I was telling my family that their cruelty was acceptable. I was so terrified of being the difficult daughter, so desperate to maintain my role as the reliable peacemaker, that I offered up my husband's dignity as a sacrifice on the altar of my family's ego. The realization did not hit me all at once. It built up over 11 years, a slow accumulation of tiny betrayals, a pressure cooker of unsaid words. I had spent my entire life putting out fires for the Ashmore family, never realizing they were perfectly willing to let my life burn to the ground if it provided them with a little extra warmth. My compliance had bought me nothing but a front-row seat to the quiet humiliation of the man I loved most. It took a long time to understand that true maturity is not about avoiding the conflict. It is about knowing exactly when the conflict is necessary. I had spent 37 years being the girl who took the hit, so no one else had to. But the moment my silence finally hurt, the only man who had always stood by me, the reliable daughter, died, and the director of risk investigation finally took over. That was the moment the reliable daughter ended, and the risk investigator took over. To understand how that moment unfolded, go back a few hours. To understand how that moment happened, I need to take you back to the beginning of that evening. The drive from Charlotte to Greenville always took exactly 2 hours and 15 minutes, a stretch of highway I usually spent mentally bracing myself for the atmospheric pressure of my childhood home. In the passenger seat, Evan held a meticulously hand-wrapped gift box resting on his lap. Inside the box was a bottle of vintage Bordeaux he had spent 3 weeks researching and tracking down. He had paid over $100 for it, a significant sum on his educator salary, specifically because he remembered my father mentioning that particular vineyard during a Thanksgiving dinner 5 years ago. That is the kind of man Evan is. He pays attention to the details that no one else bothers to remember, investing time and care into people who rarely return the favor. The moment we crossed the threshold into the grand foyer of the house, I felt the familiar, heavy shift in the air. The house was buzzing with caterers carrying silver trays and a live string quartet playing in the corner. But within 10 seconds, I realized the energy in the room had absolutely nothing to do with celebrating my mother turning 60. The birthday was merely a convenient backdrop, an expensive stage set constructed for a singular purpose. This evening was an official debut. It was the premiere of Grant Ellison. My mother, Celeste, was already in full performance mode. She wore a tailored cream dress and heavy pearls, floating from group to group with Grant securely attached to her arm. I watched her glide up to a circle of her oldest country club rivals, her voice intentionally elevated so it could carry over the music. "Grant is currently looking at some major resort deals down the coast," she announced, her tone laced with a thick, syrupy pride. She did not say he worked in real estate. She said he was looking at major resort deals. a carefully chosen phrase designed to signal to every woman in the room that her youngest daughter had secured a man of serious, undisputed capital. It was the tone of a woman who had just acquired a rare, priceless artifact and could not wait to watch her friends seethe with envy. While Grant was being paraded around like a prize-winning thoroughbred, I looked around for my husband. I found Evan near the back patio doors. My father, Warren, was standing there looking completely flustered, his forehead shining with sweat as he tried to figure out how to rearrange the heavy wrought iron patio furniture to accommodate the overflow of guests. Before my father could even ask for assistance, Evan had already taken off his suit jacket, draped it over a chair, and rolled up his crisp white sleeves. For the next hour, while the rest of the party drank expensive champagne and mingled, Evan quietly became the unpaid, invisible staff. I watched him carry 3 heavy bags of ice from the caterer's van outside all the way into the kitchen. I watched him help the valet attendants shift cars in the crowded driveway so my elderly aunt could leave early. I watched him steady a massive floral arrangement that was threatening to tip over on the main buffet table. He did the real, physical, unglamorous work required to keep the evening running smoothly. No one called his name to thank him. No one offered him a drink or a napkin to wipe his hands. He was simply treated as part of the infrastructure, expected to function silently in the background while the real guests enjoyed themselves. In stark contrast, Grant had anchored himself at the custom mahogany wet bar in the center of the living room. He held a crystal tumbler of neat bourbon, using it as a prop while he held court. A small crowd of my parents' wealthy friends had gathered around him, entirely captivated. "It is all about recognizing the undervalued assets," Grant was saying, flashing his perfect predatory smile at a local bank manager. "We were looking at a property in Aspen last winter. The infrastructure was an absolute disaster, but the location was prime. You have to be willing to gut the whole thing and rebuild from the ground up if you want that 40% return on investment." It was a masterful performance of half-truths and aggressive financial buzzwords. He spoke about Miami beachfronts, luxury ski lodges, and equity funds with a casual arrogance that mesmerized people who equated confidence with true competence. He did not actually specify what he owned or what he had successfully built. He just painted a picture of close proximity to massive wealth, and the people in this room swallowed it whole. Sloane stood slightly behind him, sipping a vodka martini, absolutely glowing with a toxic, triumphant energy. For her entire life, she had been the beautiful disaster, the daughter who brought home artists, struggling musicians, and men with vague business ideas that my mother openly despised. But tonight, she was the golden child. She caught my eye from across the room, and I saw a new, sharp edge of superiority in her gaze. She was gloating. She had finally delivered a man who made our mother swoon, and in doing so, she unconsciously cemented her newfound disdain for me. Standing by the wall, swirling an untouched glass of sparkling water, the sickening truth finally crystallized in my mind. My family did not just like Grant. They were weaponizing him. They were using his flashy tailored suits, his loud promises, and his supposed financial pedigree as a silent, ongoing judgment against my own choices. Grant was the living embodiment of everything they thought I should have demanded for myself, and his presence was a loud declaration that I had settled for less. The hostility shifted from unspoken to explicitly verbal when we finally sat down for the formal dinner. The long dining table was set with heavy silver and fine bone china. Evan was seated near the far end, away from the center of gravity, while Grant was given the seat of honor directly next to my mother. Between the salad course and the roasted tenderloin, my aunt leaned heavily across the table and locked eyes with Evan. "So, Evan," she said loudly, ensuring the conversation around them stopped, "are you still teaching at the public high school?" "Yes, ma'am," Evan replied politely, placing his fork down on his plate. "I am actually taking over the advanced placement history classes this fall." My aunt offered a tight, deeply sympathetic smile. "You teach? Well, that is very stable. Good benefits, I assume." She dragged out the word stable as if she were diagnosing a terminal illness. It was not a compliment. It was a sharp insult wrapped in polite Southern concern, implying that his life was horribly boring and entirely devoid of ambition. Before Evan could even form a gracious response, my mother seamlessly hijacked the conversation, waving her hand as if swatting away a mildly annoying fly. "Grant, tell everyone about that project in Florida," Celeste urged, her eyes shining with pure adoration. "Grant is thinking about buying an entire hotel chain down there. It is just an acquisition phase," Grant replied with false humility, leaning back in his velvet chair and swirling his wine. "But yes, the luxury hospitality sector is where the real legacy building happens." I sat there, gripping the stem of my wineglass so tightly I thought the crystal might shatter and cut my hand. I looked down the table at Evan. He was cutting his steak, his face completely neutral, offering a polite, practiced smile to the very people who were actively diminishing his worth between bites of expensive food. He was taking the hits because he loved me, because he knew that defending himself would cause a scene, and because he knew how much I despised family conflict. For 11 years, I had convinced myself that keeping the peace was an act of grace. I thought I was taking the high road by ignoring the constant, subtle disrespect. I thought I was being the bigger person. But as I sat at that table, watching my family elevate a fast-talking stranger while treating a truly good man like a piece of faded wallpaper, I felt physically ill. My silence was no longer keeping the peace. It was active complicity. Every time I swallowed my anger to keep the dinner pleasant, every time I let a snide comment slide to avoid making my mother uncomfortable, I was betraying my husband. Looking at Evan's quiet dignity amidst their loud arrogance, the bitter truth coated my tongue. My restraint was not maturity, it was cowardice. And sitting in that dining room, listening to them laugh at jokes that were not funny, I realized that I could not be a coward anymore. The dessert plates had just been cleared away by the catering staff, leaving a lingering scent of spun sugar and bitter espresso in the air. It was nearly 10 o'clock in the evening. The atmosphere out on the sprawling stone patio had cooled considerably, carrying the sharp, pine-scented chill of the South Carolina night. Before anyone could signal for the massive, three-tiered, chocolate fondant cake to be wheeled out, my mother stood up from her seat at the head of the table. She tapped her manicured fingernail against her crystal water glass. The sharp, high-pitched ringing sliced cleanly through the low hum of 50 wealthy guests conversing. "Everyone, if I could have your undivided attention for just one moment," Celeste announced. Her voice projected across the terrace with the effortless, practiced command of a seasoned stage actress. "Before we cut the birthday cake, I want to take advantage of this magnificent setup. I hired a specialized crew to rig professional lighting out by the Rose Garden. I want to capture an official family portrait to commemorate tonight." A polite murmur of approval rippled through the seated crowd. Guests swiveled in their chairs, turning their bodies to face the manicured lawn. Out by the manicured rose bushes, a pair of tall industrial light stands hummed quietly, casting a brilliant, stark white glow over a designated patch of grass. It did not look like a setting for a warm family memory. It looked like an interrogation stage. My mother marched toward the center of the illuminated grass, immediately taking control of the space. She began physically directing the scene, waving her hands and pointing at the ground as if she were choreographing a Broadway finale. "Warren, darling, you stand right here in the center," she ordered. My father obediently shuffled into the blinding light, adjusting his silk tie and offering a stiff, rehearsed smile to the audience of guests watching from the patio. "Sloan, you stand to his right. Vanessa, you come stand to his left," she continued, her tone brisk and entirely devoid of warmth. I walked onto the grass. The ground was soft, and the heels of my shoes sank slightly into the damp earth. I took my designated spot on my father's left side. As I turned to face the audience, I instinctively took a half step to my right, leaving a noticeable, purposeful gap on my left side. It was a space exactly the width of my husband's shoulders. We had stood in this exact formation for 11 years. I smoothed the front of my dress and waited for Evan to step into the light beside me. My mother turned around to survey her work. She looked at my father, then at my sister, and then at me. Finally, her eyes landed on Evan, who was standing a few feet away in the shadows, holding his suit jacket over his forearm. "Evan, you take the picture for the whole family," Celeste said. Her voice was not loud, but the absolute silence on the patio made the words ring out like a dropped pane of glass. She did not ask him. She did not frame it as a favor. It was a direct, undeniable command. "Sloane and Grant look so beautiful on camera. It would be a waste to leave them out," she added, her voice dripping with a sickeningly sweet, entirely fake sincerity. With those two sentences, my mother executed a flawless, public execution of my husband's status. By telling him to take the picture for the family, she explicitly declared that he was not a part of the family. She had formally demoted him from a son-in-law to an unpaid member of the service staff, right in front of 50 people who held immense social power in our hometown. She walked over to a small wrought iron side table, picked up a heavy professional-grade digital camera left by the hired crew, and held it out toward Evan. Time seemed to slow down to a grueling, agonizing crawl. The ambient noise of the evening faded completely, leaving only the low, electrical hum of the lighting rigs. I turned my head to look at Evan. He did not flush with anger. His jaw did not clench. He did not look at my mother with hatred or jealousy. He simply looked at me. Our eyes locked for exactly 1 second. It was a look of profound, quiet devastation. It was the look of a deeply decent man who had just been publicly stripped of his dignity and realized that the people he had served all night viewed him as entirely disposable. He understood exactly what was happening. He was being erased. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to move. My heart hammered violently against my ribs. My throat tightened until it was difficult to draw breath. I wanted to step out of the glaring white light. I wanted to walk across the grass, snatch the heavy camera from my mother's hands, and throw it into the deep end of the swimming pool. I wanted to scream the word no until my voice went hoarse. I wanted to grab my husband by the hand, walk out through the front gates, and never look back. But I did not move. The invisible chains of my Ashmore upbringing locked my feet to the damp earth. The decades of conditioning paralyzed me. A voice in my head, sounding exactly like my mother, repeated the cardinal rules of our existence. Do not ruin the evening. Do not embarrass the family in front of the guests. Do not make a scene. Swallow the humiliation. Smile through the discomfort, and maintain the illusion of perfection at all absolute costs. I was terrified of being the difficult daughter. I was terrified of the icy silence and the brutal reprimands that would follow if I dared to defend my own marriage. Evan slowly reached out and took the camera from my mother's outstretched hands. He took 2 steps backward, retreating further into the shadows. At that exact moment, Grant Ellison stepped effortlessly into the glaring light. He did not hesitate. He did not offer an apologetic glance toward Evan. He simply walked into the empty space I had left for my husband. Sliding his arm around Sloane's waist, Grant planted his feet and flashed a bright, blindingly perfect smile toward the lens. The true cruelty of the moment lay in its absolute effortlessness. Grant did not have to try to be malicious. He simply believed, with every fiber of his being, that he deserved to stand there more than the man who had loved me for over a decade. "All right, everyone, look right at the lens," Evan said. His voice was steady, calm, and completely devoid of emotion. I stared straight ahead. I forced the corners of my mouth to curve upward into the standard, hollow Ashmore smile I had perfected since childhood. The mechanical snap of the shutter echoed sharply across the lawn. The bright flash blinded me for a fraction of a second, leaving a dark, floating spot in my vision. "Let us do another one, just to be sure," Celeste called out from the center of the group, waving her hand dismissively. My eyes might have been closed. "Make sure you get the lighting right. Evan," it was a deliberate, calculated twist of the knife. One photograph was a humiliation. Demanding multiple shots was a public display of dominance. She was forcing him to document his own replacement, over and over again. Of course, Evan replied softly. He raised the camera to his eye again. Snap. One more, Evan. Make sure you get my good side, Sloane chimed in, leaning her head against Grant's shoulder and laughing. Snap. And a final one for safety, my mother instructed. Snap. I stood completely rigid through every single click of the shutter. I did not blink. I did not breathe. The glaring white light felt hot against my skin. But internally, I was freezing cold. With every flash that illuminated the lawn, I felt another piece of my soul fracture. I was not just standing there, I was participating. By remaining frozen in my spot, by holding that fake, pathetic smile, I was actively validating their cruelty. I was looking directly at the only person in the world who had ever made me feel safe, and I was allowing him to be treated like a ghost. I realized, with a sickening wave of absolute clarity, that I had become the worst kind of coward. The family I had spent my entire life trying to protect was standing right beside me, but the only person I was truly betraying was the man behind the lens. The heavy steel doors of my parents' estate closed behind us, but the suffocating weight of the evening followed us directly into the enclosed cabin of our sedan. We merged onto Interstate 85 North, heading back toward Charlotte under a pitch-black, starless sky. For the first 30 minutes of the drive, the only sounds existing in the world were the rhythmic thrum of the tires against the asphalt and the low, steady hum of the car heater. Evan kept his eyes locked on the red taillights of a semi-truck a quarter-mile ahead. Both of his hands rested loosely on the steering wheel. He was driving exactly at the 65 miles per hour speed limit. He did not grip the leather until his knuckles turned white. He did not aggressively pass other vehicles. He did not sigh heavily or radiate a hostile, seething anger. And that was the most terrifying part. If he had yelled, I would have known how to respond. I had spent my entire life navigating explosive Ashmore tantrums and diffusing theatrical rage. I knew how to manage anger, but Evan was not angry. He was entirely, profoundly calm. His silence was not a weapon designed to punish me. It was the quiet retreat of a man who had finally accepted a heartbreaking reality. His unwavering decency, even in the aftermath of such a brutal humiliation, was a mirror reflecting my own absolute failure. The dashboard illuminated the sharp line of his jaw in a faint, blue glow. I swallowed hard. The inside of my throat felt like dry ash. I shifted in the passenger seat, the rustle of my silk dress sounding incredibly loud in the quiet cabin. I needed to say something. I needed to deploy the familiar script I had used for 11 years, a rapid, breathless apology followed by a detailed rationalization of my mother's behavior. Evan, I whispered, the word barely scraping past my lips. I am so incredibly sorry. You know how she gets when there is an audience. She was just trying to show off, and it was entirely wrong. Evan did not look away from the road. He let my pathetic, recycled excuse hang in the air for a long moment before he finally spoke. His voice was soft, barely carrying over the sound of the engine, but the words hit me with the force of a physical blow. Am I still just a guest in your house? He asked. The question paralyzed me. It bypassed every single defense mechanism, every logical justification, and every professional excuse I had built over the last decade. It struck the absolute core of the issue. He was not asking about the photograph. He was asking about his place in my life. No, I choked out, a sudden, sharp ache blooming behind my ribs. No, of course not. You are my husband. Evan finally turned his head to look at me. The dashboard light caught the deep, exhausted sorrow in his eyes. Then why do I feel like I am constantly waiting in the hallway, hoping your family will eventually invite me into the room? He asked quietly. I do not care about Grant Ellison. He is just a guy playing the hand your mother dealt him. I do not care about Sloane wanting to be the center of attention. They are who they are. The person who hurt me tonight was not your mother. Vanessa. He paused, turning his attention back to the dark highway. The person who hurt me tonight was the woman who stood perfectly still under those lights and let it happen. The deepest pain was watching my wife decide that keeping her mother comfortable was more important than standing next to her husband. I broke. It was not a cinematic, graceful weeping. It was a harsh, ugly, involuntary sob that tore out of my chest. I pressed my palms against my eyes, feeling the hot tears spill over my fingers. I was not crying because I felt misunderstood. I was crying because, for the very first time in my life, I was looking at my own true reflection, and I absolutely despised the coward staring back at me. For 37 years, I had proudly worn the badge of the reliable, mature daughter. I believed my ability to absorb insults and maintain the aesthetic of family harmony made me strong. But sitting in the dark cabin of that car, the truth was brutally clear. I was not strong. I was broken. I had been conditioned to worship at the altar of the Ashmore reputation, and I had dutifully sacrificed the dignity of the only man who truly loved me just to keep the peace. I had sold out my own husband to appease a woman who would never, ever be satisfied. "You are right," I said, my voice trembling, thick with tears. "You are completely right. I left you standing in the dark. I stood there and I let them erase you." I reached across the center console and placed my hand over his arm. His muscles were tense under the fabric of his shirt. "I have spent my whole life being terrified of ruining the picture," I confessed, the words pouring out of me in a desperate rush. "I was taught that if you cause a scene, you are the problem. I was so scared of my mother's judgment that I stopped seeing what it was costing us, what it was costing you. I thought I was protecting us by ignoring it." Evan looked at my hand resting on his arm, but he did not pull away. "Ignoring a fire does not put it out, Vanessa. It just lets it burn the house down while you are looking the other way," he said softly. I wiped my face with the back of my hand, smearing my expensive makeup. A profound, fundamental shift was happening inside my chest. The obedient daughter who flinched at her mother's tone was dead. The woman sitting in the passenger seat was finally awake. "It ends tonight," I said. My voice was no longer trembling. It was dropping into the cold, calculated register I used when analyzing a hostile corporate takeover. "I swear to you, Evan, it ends right now. I am never walking into that house again until they look you in the eye and apologize. We are not going to Thanksgiving. We are not going to the Christmas Eve gala. We are not attending any arbitrary Sunday dinners. Unless you are treated with the exact same respect they demand for themselves, they will not get a single second of my time. You are my family. They are just relatives." Evan let out a long, shuddering breath. The rigid tension in his shoulders finally began to soften. He turned his hand over, lacing his fingers through mine. We did not need to sign a treaty or draft a formal agreement. In the quiet darkness of the car, traveling at 65 miles per hour toward our real home, we established an impenetrable boundary. We were officially resigning from our roles as the accommodating, polite punching bags. We would no longer let them drown us in their toxic, superficial politeness. We arrived back at our house in the Charlotte suburbs just past 1 in the morning. The familiar, comforting weight of our life greeted us, the soft glow of the porch light, the eager clicking of our dog's nails against the hardwood floor as he rushed to the door to meet us, the quiet safety of our own 4 walls. While Evan took the dog out to the backyard, I walked into our bedroom and sat on the edge of the mattress. The house was completely silent. I reached into my purse and pulled out my phone. I had ignored it for the entire drive. The screen lit up with 3 missed calls from my father regarding a tax document he needed me to review, and a notification from a social media app. I tapped the notification. It opened directly to Sloane's profile. There it was. The photograph, it was perfectly lit, heavily filtered, and meticulously cropped. My father stood in the center, looking distinguished. Sloane leaned into Grant, radiating triumph. And I stood on the edge, a stiff, hollow smile plastered across my face, an empty space gaping beside me. The caption read, "Celebrating 60 years of the matriarch. Family is absolutely everything. So blessed to welcome the newest addition to our inner circle." She had tagged Grant. She had tagged my mother. She had tagged the caterer and the lighting company. I stared at the glowing screen until my eyes burned. Looking at that curated, flawless image, the final trace of my guilt completely evaporated. Evan was the one who had carried the ice, moved the cars, and poured the drinks. Evan was the one who had held the heavy camera steady in the cold air so they could look perfect. Yet, in the official documented history that the Ashmore family was broadcasting to the world, Evan Mercer simply did not exist. I did not leave a comment. I did not send a text. I locked my phone, tossed it onto the nightstand, and listened to the sound of my husband walking back through our front door. They had their picture. But starting tomorrow, they were going to learn exactly what happens when the person holding the foundation together decides to walk away. The phone rang at 10 o'clock the next morning. I was sitting at my kitchen island in Charlotte, holding a mug of black coffee, watching Evan through the window as he played fetch with our golden retriever in the backyard. When my mother's name flashed across the screen, my heart rate did not spike. My palms did not sweat. For the first time in 37 years, I felt absolutely nothing but a cold, clinical detachment. I swiped the green button and put her on speakerphone. "Vanessa, darling," Celeste began, her voice breezy and light, completely devoid of any remorse. She was calling to smooth over the rough edges of the previous night with a thick layer of denial, just as she always did. "I hope you two got back safely. I must say, you rushed out so quickly. It was quite rude to the other guests, but I suppose we can overlook it. You are just being entirely too sensitive about the whole camera arrangement. Honestly, Evan really needs to learn how to loosen up a bit." In the past, this exact script would have triggered a frantic need within me to explain myself. I would have spent 45 minutes on the phone, negotiating for a shred of validation, trying to make her see my perspective. I would have pleaded for her to understand. I did not plead. I took a slow sip of my coffee. "We will not be attending Thanksgiving this year," I said, my voice as flat and unyielding as a slab of concrete. "We will not be coming for Christmas, either. In fact, we will not be attending any family gatherings, large or small, until Evan receives a direct, in-person apology from you." The silence on the other end of the line was absolute. It was the sound of a woman who had just walked into a glass door she did not know was there. "Are you threatening me over a photograph?" she finally snapped, the breezy facade shattering instantly. "You are letting a man divide your own family. Vanessa, you are making a massive mistake." "It is not a negotiation," I replied simply. "Goodbye, Mother." I hung up the phone. I did not block her number, nor did I block my father or Sloane. I wanted the channels open, not for conversation, but for observation. The family reacted exactly according to their predictable psychological profiles. My father, Warren, maintained his cowardly silence. He did not call or text, choosing to hide behind his wife's rage rather than confront his eldest daughter. Sloane sent a barrage of text messages calling me dramatic, petty, and jealous of her happiness. I read them all, deleted them, and went outside to help Evan rake the yard. True revenge, I quickly learned, does not require a grand, fiery confrontation. It merely requires the withdrawal of your own unappreciated competence. My father owned Ashmore Living and Design, a highly lucrative chain of boutique furniture showrooms scattered across the Southeast. For nearly a decade, I had been operating as the unpaid, unofficial chief risk officer for his entire enterprise. They treated my labor as a casual, expected daughterly duty. They thought I just glanced over a few papers while watching television. They had absolutely no concept of the catastrophes I quietly neutralized on a weekly basis. That Tuesday, the first test arrived. My father forwarded me a 70-page commercial lease agreement for a new warehouse facility. His note read, "Take a quick look at this before Friday. Need to know if the landlord is sneaking anything in." I replied within 2 minutes. "I am currently at capacity with my firm. I am unable to review this document. Please consult your retained legal counsel." A week later, he sent an email asking me to analyze a tricky tax compliance issue regarding interstate shipping vendors. I replied with the exact same message. I stopped taking his frantic Sunday morning phone calls about employee liability disputes. I stopped drafting his vendor termination letters. I completely sealed the vault of my professional expertise. When you have spent your entire life functioning as the load-bearing wall for other people's incompetence, they do not realize the roof is heavy until you step out of the way. It took exactly 3 months for the structural damage to become visible. By late summer, the cracks were splitting wide open. Through a mutual acquaintance in the local business sector, I learned that my father had signed that warehouse lease without my review. He had completely missed a catastrophic indemnity clause hidden in the fine print, making his company entirely liable for any structural repairs to the roof. A month later, Ashmore Living and Design received a devastating compliance fine of $15,000 from the State Revenue Department because they had misclassified their shipping contractors, the exact tax issue I had refused to fix for them. Then came the flagship showroom in downtown Charleston. The lease was up for renewal. I had spent the previous 3 renewals aggressively negotiating the terms to keep the overhead low. This time, my father handled it himself. The property management group saw the weakness, smelled the desperation, and locked him into a new 5-year contract with a brutal 20% rent hike that instantly vaporized their quarterly profit margins. Despite the mounting financial bleeding, my mother refused to connect the dots. In her world, acknowledging that their stability relied on the daughter she constantly undermined was an impossible pill to swallow. She framed the disastrous business quarter as a string of terrible luck and a challenging economic climate. More importantly, she found her ultimate scapegoat and savior wrapped into one. Celeste doubled down on her blind faith in Grant Ellison. If the business was struggling, she reasoned, it was simply because my father was getting too old and out of touch. She proudly told her country club circle that Grant, with his sophisticated understanding of high-level corporate structures, was going to step in and modernize the entire family portfolio. She firmly believed his shiny veneer of success would effortlessly fix the very real bleeding wounds I had left behind. While the Ashmore empire quietly began to hemorrhage money and credibility, my life in Charlotte transformed into something unrecognizable and incredibly beautiful. By cutting the umbilical cord of toxic obligation, Evan and I gained hundreds of hours of our lives back. Our weekends were no longer hijacked by tense, agonizing 2-hour drives to Greenville. We no longer spent our Sunday evenings emotionally exhausted, debriefing the passive-aggressive insults we had endured over dinner. Instead, we built our own world. We established new traditions. Every Saturday morning, we walked to a local bakery and bought fresh pastries, eating them on our front porch while reading the newspaper. We started a massive vegetable garden in our backyard, spending hours with our hands in the dirt, laughing and talking without the looming shadow of my mother's judgment hanging over us. Evan seemed lighter, taller, unburdened by the constant need to prove his worth to people who were determined to misunderstand him. One evening in early autumn, as we sat by the fire pit in our backyard, watching the dog chase falling leaves, a profound sense of peace settled over my shoulders. I took a sip of my wine and looked at the life we had cultivated. It was only in the stark, quiet beauty of this newfound peace that I fully comprehended the exorbitant price I had been paying for all those years. I had been paying for my family's comfort with my own sanity, my own time, and my husband's dignity. They had demanded a luxury service while refusing to acknowledge the bill. Now, the invoice had finally come due. I was no longer standing in the gap to protect them from their own arrogance. I was sitting comfortably by the fire, entirely out of reach, quietly waiting for the inevitable collapse. Nature abhors a vacuum. In the highly curated, status-obsessed ecosystem of my family, that vacuum was the sudden, glaring absence of my free labor. Grant Ellison did not just politely step into the empty space I left behind. He aggressively colonized it. He did not do this out of a sudden surge of familial affection or a desire to bond with my aging father. He moved in because he recognized an absolute goldmine. He looked at Ashmore Living and Design and saw a vulnerable, legacy business owned by a man desperate to maintain appearances, managed by a matriarch who valued aesthetic bragging rights over actual profit margins. To a predator wearing a bespoke tailored suit, my family was the perfect mark. Grant initiated his takeover with a grand, sweeping proposal designed to exploit their vanity. He sat in my parents' formal living room and told my father, Warren, that simply selling luxury sofas and imported dining tables was a painfully outdated business model. He pitched an evolution. He wanted to secure a massive, high-ceilinged warehouse space in the trendy, rapidly gentrifying art district of Greenville and transform it into an experiential showroom. It would not just be a store, it would be a lifestyle destination. He envisioned an artisanal espresso bar wrapped in imported Italian marble, a curated gallery space for high-end networking events, and interactive, VIP design studios. My mother was absolutely intoxicated by the concept. It sounded incredibly wealthy. It was no longer just a retail furniture chain, it was a cultural hub. She could already hear herself casually dropping the phrase, experiential showroom, over lunch with her charity board members. For my sister, Sloane, this project was her ultimate victory lap. She positioned herself right in the middle of the whirlwind, playing the role of the visionary muse. She desperately wanted to prove, once and for all, that the man she brought into the family was a titan of industry, fundamentally superior to the quiet, steady public school teacher I had married. She basked in the glowing approval of our mother, thrilled to finally be the golden child bringing a lucrative, modern future to the Ashmore legacy. Grant moved swiftly to solidify his control. He began showing up at my father's private internal staff meetings. He inserted himself into critical discussions with the commercial lenders. He weaponized a vocabulary of hollow, aggressive financial buzzwords to overwhelm anyone who dared to question him. He spoke rapidly about leveraging brand equity, optimizing liquid working capital, curating the omnichannel customer journey, and disruptive market positioning. My father, who had built his wealth in the 1980s by simply selling solid oak tables to affluent suburbanites, was entirely out of his depth. Warren nodded along during these meetings, deeply intimidated by the modern corporate jargon. He assumed that because Grant sounded so remarkably confident, he must know exactly what he was doing. The collision course became entirely clear to me on a random Tuesday afternoon. Despite my strict boundaries, my father occasionally left sprawling, slightly panicked voicemails on my phone, hoping I would magically cave and solve a minor crisis for him. I was sitting at my desk in Charlotte, about to delete his latest message regarding a zoning permit, when he casually dropped a detail that made the blood freeze in my veins. He mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that Grant was setting up a separate limited liability company to act as a middleman for the new showroom's construction and vendor contracts. Grant had convinced my father that this structure would streamline the cash flow and shield the main Ashmore enterprise from direct construction liability. The director of risk investigation inside me woke up instantly. My professional instincts fired like warning flares, lighting up a pitch-black sky. An intermediary entity managed by an outsider with no legal tie to the family business was not a protective shield. It was a funnel. In my line of work, this was the exact architectural blueprint for corporate embezzlement. The structure would allow Grant to receive the bank loan funds, aggressively mark up the invoices from the local contractors, pay those contractors the lower actual amount, and quietly pocket the massive difference through management fees buried deep within the operating agreement. I did not need a subpoena to confirm my suspicions. I just needed to know where to look. I opened my laptop, accessed the public financial databases and state commercial registries I used every single day, and began pulling the threads of Grant Ellison's polished professional history. It took me exactly 2 hours to completely strip away his veneer. The red flags were glaring, buried just beneath the surface of his heavily curated online presence. First, I found a civil lawsuit filed 3 years ago in a Miami district court. A boutique hospitality group had sued a development company managed by Grant for severe late payments to subcontractors. The case had been settled quietly out of court, but the legal footprints remained permanently stamped in the public record. Second, I uncovered the abrupt, messy dissolution of a commercial real estate partnership he had recently touted to my mother as a massive triumph. The primary equity investor had pulled all funding with zero public explanation, a classic, undeniable hallmark of discovered financial misconduct. Finally, I cross-referenced his professional portfolio. The multi-million-dollar luxury resort deals he constantly bragged about at family dinners. He was never a primary developer or a managing partner. He was a low-level broker who earned a standard finder's fee and walked away before the concrete was even poured on the foundation. He was inflating his actual net worth and industry influence by a factor of 10. I had promised my husband I would not engage with their toxic drama, but this was no longer about family dynamics or wounded pride. This was about watching a man drive a heavily loaded train directly off a cliff, while my parents sat comfortably in the dining car complaining about the temperature of the wine. I picked up my phone and dialed my father's private office line. He answered on the third ring, sounding surprised and slightly breathless. "Vanessa," Warren said, clearing his throat loudly, "it is good to hear from you. Are you calling about the zoning permits I mentioned on Tuesday?" "No," I said, keeping my voice entirely devoid of emotion, channeling the absolute icy authority I used when delivering bad news to corporate executives. "I am calling to give you one single piece of professional advice. Do not sign a single contract that routes Ashmore money through an entity controlled by Grant Ellison. If he insists on using a new intermediary company for the showroom build-out, you must hire an independent forensic accountant to audit the operating agreement before you put your signature on anything." There was a heavy, suffocating pause on the line. I could practically hear him bristling, his pride instantly flaring up to defend his new golden boy. "Grant knows exactly what he is doing," my father replied, his tone turning defensive and sharply condescending. "He is structuring this to protect our assets. It is a very sophisticated strategy. Vanessa, I know you deal with standard corporate compliance, but this is high-level commercial development. You do not have the full picture. It is a funnel," I warned him, ignoring his blatant insult. I looked at his public filings. He has a history of severe vendor disputes and dissolved partnerships that he is actively hiding from you. If you give him unilateral control of the capital through a separate entity, you lose all oversight of where the cash actually goes. The bank will hold you liable, and he will walk away clean. "Enough," Warren snapped, his voice echoing loudly and harshly through the receiver. "I am not going to sit here and listen to you tear down your sister's partner just because you are holding a grudge. You walked away from this family over a stupid photograph. Vanessa, you abandoned your responsibilities because your feelings were hurt. Now that Sloan has found a man who actually wants to help elevate this family, you are throwing out wild, baseless accusations out of pure, petty jealousy." The words hung in the air, heavy and toxic. He had taken my firm boundary, the very first time I had ever stood up for my husband's dignity, and twisted it into a cheap weapon to defend a con artist. He completely dismissed my decade of professional expertise because acknowledging my warning would require him to admit he was being played. "I am not jealous, Dad," I said quietly, the last remaining thread of my daughterly obligations snapping cleanly in half. "I am doing my job. I am explicitly telling you that the bridge is out. What you decide to do with the car is entirely up to you." I ended the call. I did not feel angry. I did not feel the desperate, familiar urge to drive 2 hours to Greenville, print out the legal documents, and force him to read the truth. I had delivered the warning. I had fulfilled the absolute last ounce of moral and ethical obligation I held toward the Ashmore legacy. They chose to believe the brilliant, flashing illusion because the truth was far too painfully ordinary for their expensive tastes. I set my phone face down on the polished wood of my desk, turned my attention back to my computer monitor, and decided to let them sail smoothly toward the rocks. When spring arrived, the inevitable progression of Grant Ellison's hostile takeover reached its next logical phase. He and my sister Sloan announced a whirlwind engagement after less than 8 months of dating. They celebrated the milestone at a remarkably lavish dinner hosted at an exclusive downtown country club, a venue chosen entirely for its photogenic architecture and its highly restrictive membership roster. I did not have to attend the dinner to know exactly how it unfolded. because my mother broadcasted every single second of it across her social media channels. Celeste uploaded a meticulously curated album of photographs featuring crystal champagne flutes, towering floral centerpieces, and Sloane showing off a diamond ring that looked aggressively large and conspicuously flawless. But it was not the photographs that caught my attention. It was the caption beneath them. My mother had written, "Celebrating the future. Grant has brought a completely new vision to the Ashmore family. We are finally stepping into a brand new tier of excellence." It was a public coronation. With those 3 sentences, my mother had officially drawn the battle lines and chosen her champion. She was not just welcoming a son-in-law, she was loudly declaring that the family was upgrading its roster, leaving the ordinary and the unimpressive behind. We had maintained our strict boundary of avoiding private family dinners, but when the official engagement party was thrown a month later, Evan specifically asked me to go. It was a massive, sprawling event with over 200 guests, blurring the line between a personal celebration and a corporate networking gala for Ashmore living and design. Evan, in his infinite, unshakable grace, argued that refusing to show our faces in a room of 200 people would make us look bitter. He wanted to walk in, hand over a gift, pay our respects to the social contract, and walk out with our heads held high. I agreed, entirely against my better judgment. The moment we stepped into the ballroom, the social hierarchy was instantly re-established. My mother was holding court near the main bar, introducing Grant to a circle of prominent local investors. When Evan and I approached to offer our polite congratulations, Celeste did not even pause her conversation to greet us properly. She merely gestured vaguely in our direction and said to a wealthy real estate developer, "Oh, and this is Vanessa's husband. He teaches—" She dropped the sentence onto the floor like a piece of unwanted trash, immediately turning her attention back to Grant. Now, as I was saying, Grant is completely restructuring our brand's operational strategy. He is going to be the absolute savior of the family portfolio. I stood there, feeling the familiar icy prickle of rage at the back of my neck. But before I could simply turn and walk away, the real estate developer let out a booming, jovial laugh. He looked Evan up and down, clearly remembering the gossip from my mother's birthday months prior. "Ah, the teacher," the man said, swirling the ice in his glass. "Tell me, are you the one who takes those family portraits so professionally? I heard you have a real eye for staying behind the lens." A chorus of light, polite laughter erupted from the circle. Sloane, standing nearby, giggled into her champagne glass. Grant offered a sympathetic, deeply patronizing smile. They had dragged the old humiliation out of the dark and stomped on it right in front of us, wrapping it in the guise of a harmless party joke. I looked at Evan. His expression did not change. He merely offered a tight, polite nod, placed our gift envelope on the table, and quietly suggested we go grab a drink from the other side of the room. We left the party less than an hour later. During the drive back to Charlotte, I did not cry. I did not shake with adrenaline. The desperate, agonizing need to make my family understand my pain had completely evaporated. I was no longer a wounded daughter begging for respect. I was a director of risk investigations staring at a massive, unmitigated liability. That night, in the quiet glow of my home office, I made a definitive shift in strategy. I stopped trying to warn the people who were determined to drown, and I started building an ironclad lifeboat for myself and my husband. I opened a secure, encrypted folder on my personal server and began compiling the timeline. I became the forensic auditor of my own family's demise. I combed through months of digital history. I took screenshots of every single text message where my father begged me to review legal documents, followed immediately by the messages where he completely dismissed my warnings about Grant's intermediary company. I archived the emails where my mother called my professional advice petty and jealous. I built a chronological ledger proving unequivocally that I had identified the structural rot, reported it to the ownership, and was subsequently locked out of the boardroom. Then, I turned my attention to Grant. Through my network of corporate compliance analysts, I managed to quietly acquire copies of the preliminary investment pitches Grant had been circulating to regional banks. He was actively trying to secure a commercial line of credit for the new showroom build-out. The numbers in his pitch deck were entirely fictitious. He was projecting a 300% growth in retail foot traffic within the first 6 months. He was claiming operational profit margins that defied the basic laws of retail economics. Worse, I found multiple email chains where he aggressively used the Ashmore family name and legacy to strong-arm local vendors into waiving their standard upfront deposit requirements. He was building a house of cards, and he was using my father's 4 decades of good credit as the foundation. I saved every single attachment. I cataloged every fraudulent projection. I built an impenetrable wall of evidence that would legally and financially insulate me and Evan from the catastrophic fallout I knew was coming. The most terrifying aspect of my preparation was how incredibly peaceful our house remained. Evan never once asked me to retaliate. He never demanded revenge. He spent his evenings grading history essays at the kitchen table, entirely unbothered by the grand, theatrical circus happening 2 hours south of us. His profound calm was the very thing that sharpened my focus. Because he was so inherently good. I did not need to scream or fight or throw accusations. I simply needed to wait. I would let the truth naturally peel the cheap, shiny paint off my family's beautiful illusion. But the absolute breaking point, the moment that elevated my plan from self-preservation to a guaranteed, surgical strike, arrived on a rainy Thursday afternoon. A colleague of mine, an underwriter at a commercial lending firm in Atlanta, sent me a highly confidential email. He knew my maiden name and wanted to discreetly verify a document that had crossed his desk. "Vanessa," his note read, "is your family actually backing this new development group? The ownership structure looks incredibly messy, but the applicant claims deep, embedded ties to the founding family." I opened the attached PDF. It was the master prospectus for Grant Ellison's newly formed limited liability company, the entity he was using to funnel the loan money. I scrolled past the title page, past the executive summary, and stopped cold on page 4. There, positioned prominently under the heading of Executive Leadership and Family Integration, was a full-page, high-resolution photograph. It was the family portrait from my mother's 60th birthday. It was the exact image where my father stood in the center, where Sloane smiled radiantly, and where Grant stood firmly in the middle of the Ashmore dynasty. It was the photograph that had required Evan to step down into the shadows and hold the camera. Grant was using that very picture as tangible, documentary evidence to convince strict commercial bankers that he possessed the full, undisputed backing of the Ashmore empire. He was leveraging the image of his fabricated belonging to secure millions of dollars in unsecured debt. I sat at my desk, staring at the screen, a slow, cold realization washing over me. The photograph they had orchestrated to humiliate my husband, the picture they used to actively erase a good man from our family history, had just become the primary instrument of a massive corporate fraud. It was a piece of poetic justice so perfect it almost felt choreographed. I closed the PDF and saved it to my encrypted drive. I leaned back in my chair and looked out the window at the rain falling over Charlotte. The weapon they used to cut Evan out of the frame was the exact same weapon that was going to destroy their entire legacy. And when the bomb finally went off, I decided in that quiet room I would not step in front of the shrapnel to shield a single one of them. By early autumn, the glittering, golden illusion of Grant Ellison finally began to fracture under the crushing, undeniable weight of basic mathematics. The grand experiential showroom in Greenville, the massive project that was supposed to permanently catapult Ashmore Living and Design into a new stratosphere of high society wealth, was bleeding capital at an astonishing, uncontrollable rate. The early construction phases were severely delayed, and the primary structural contractor had officially invoked a brutal, unforgiving penalty clause buried deep within the agreement my father had blindly signed. Within 2 months, the project was over budget by hundreds of thousands of dollars. The financial rot did not stop at the construction site. The regional commercial bank financing the aggressive expansion grew deeply suspicious of the opaque legal framework Grant had designed. The loan officers demanded additional, heavy collateral from my father's personal estate, citing the murky, convoluted flow of loan disbursements moving through Grant's intermediary company. For the absolute first time in his professional life, my father, Warren, experienced genuine, unmitigated panic. The polished, aggressive financial jargon Grant used to dazzle him in the living room held absolutely zero weight against hard, unforgiving bank statements. Warren realized, with a sickening drop in his stomach, that Grant spoke beautifully but executed absolutely nothing. The massive retail foot traffic numbers and the astronomical 30% profit margins Grant had promised were entirely fabricated. They were ghost numbers, floating in the air, rapidly dissolving upon contact with reality. Despite the mounting catastrophic evidence, my sister stubbornly refused to concede. Sloane fiercely defended her fiancé, pacing aggressively across my parents' living room and loudly blaming our father for the structural failures. She insisted that every major corporate expansion experienced difficult growing pains. She accused Warren of being far too old-fashioned, claiming his outdated, conservative retail mindset was the real reason the modern project was stalling. She was desperately, fiercely clinging to the fantasy. To admit that Grant was a fraud would mean admitting that her ultimate, shining victory over me was actually a catastrophic mistake, and her ego simply could not survive that impact. It took 3 weeks of sustained, agonizing financial bleeding for my mother to finally break her silence. Celeste called me on a Tuesday afternoon. When I answered the phone, she did not offer an apology. She did not even acknowledge the year of cold, deliberate distance that had grown between us. She simply adopted her breeziest, most casual tone, acting as if we had just spoken over brunch the day before. "Vanessa, darling," she said, her voice tight and slightly breathless with suppressed anxiety. "Your father is getting terribly overwhelmed with the paperwork for the new showroom. I know you have been incredibly busy with your own firm, but it would really ease his mind if you could just take a quick look at a few of these vendor agreements. Just a quick glance, really, to make sure everything is standard." She wanted the quiet, compliant daughter back. She wanted the free, invisible shield she had relied on for 37 years. "No," I replied, my voice perfectly level and entirely devoid of warmth. "My professional expertise is not a complimentary service this family can extract when you are desperate and completely discard when you are trying to impress your friends. You officially chose Grant to manage this vision. I suggest you trust him to finish it." I ended the call before she could draw a breath to argue. The true avalanche hit mere weeks later, accelerating the disaster far beyond simple managerial incompetence. A major steel supplier filed a formal mechanics lien against my father's flagship retail property because Grant's intermediary company had simply stopped paying their invoices. 3 days later, a senior compliance advisor from the commercial bank sent a devastating, heavily worded email demanding a formal, audited explanation for the severely inflated revenue forecasts Grant had submitted in the initial loan application. The final, fatal blow to my father's remaining pride occurred the following Monday. Warren discovered a binding, non-refundable purchase commitment for luxury imported lighting fixtures from a vendor in Italy. The document bore his authorized electronic signature, legally binding Ashmore Living and Design to a massive debt, but it was a document Warren absolutely swore he had never seen, let alone approved. Grant had not just bypassed his authority, he was actively forging his consent. But the most explosive, life-altering revelation did not come from the angry bank executives or the unpaid contractors. It came from Sloane. While trying to organize Grant's home office ahead of their upcoming winter wedding, Sloane opened his unlocked laptop to search for a catering contract. Instead, she stumbled across a hidden, encrypted folder of recent wire transfer receipts. The massive sums of money drawn from the Ashmore construction loan were not going to the local architects or the builders. Grant had been quietly, systematically funneling hundreds of thousands of dollars through 2 separate corporate entities registered in Miami. Sloane possessed enough basic awareness to run a quick public registry search. She discovered that both Florida entities were owned by Grant's former college roommates and a disgraced former business partner. He was not just mismanaging the family business out of incompetence. He was actively, intentionally embezzling the funds. Sloane realized with sudden, horrifying clarity that if she married him, her own name and her personal financial assets would be legally tethered to a massive, multi-state corporate fraud. She was about to become an accessory to a crime. The resulting panic was absolute and immediate. That Friday evening, my cell phone lit up with an incoming conference call from Greenville. My mother, my father, and my sister were all on the line. The arrogance was completely gone. The polished, high society facades had thoroughly shattered. They were speaking over one another, their voices thick with terror and raw desperation, begging me to intervene. They were begging me to use my corporate contacts, begging me to look at the ledgers, begging me to tell them how to stop the bleeding before the bank foreclosed on everything my father had built. I sat at my kitchen table in Charlotte, listening to the chaotic, weeping chorus of their downfall. Evan stood across the room, quietly leaning against the marble counter, watching me with a steady, grounding presence. I held the phone away from my ear for a long moment, letting the heavy silence stretch until their frantic pleading finally exhausted itself and died down into quiet, trembling sobs. "Listen to me very carefully," I commanded, my tone slicing through the panic like a freezing scalpel. "I will not fix this in the shadows. I will not make secret phone calls to protect anyone's fragile ego. And I will absolutely not quietly sweep Grant's criminal mess under the rug so you can save face at the country club. If you want my help, there is exactly one condition." I paused, making sure every single word landed with the heavy weight of a judge's gavel. "Everything stops being a secret. Every single forged document, every inflated projection, and every stolen dollar must be laid out on the table in front of every single person involved. We do this entirely in the light, or I do not do it at all. Those are my terms." There was a long, suffocating silence on the line. They knew exactly what that meant. It meant total, unavoidable public humiliation. It meant admitting, out loud, and to my husband's face, that they had been spectacularly, disastrously wrong. "Okay," my father finally whispered, his voice sounding incredibly frail and hollow. "Whatever you say, Vanessa. Just please come home." The call ended with a formal, shaking invitation from my mother. It was an invitation to the annual Christmas Eve dinner at the estate. Celeste, ever desperate to somehow control the narrative, even as the ship was sinking beneath her feet, called it a special dinner to heal the family. But as I set my phone down on the table and looked at my husband, I knew the absolute truth. There would be no holiday cheer, no soft lighting, and no polite, meaningless chatter. That grand dining table was going to be an execution block. It was the exact place where everything would either be brutally amputated and saved, or the entire Ashmore family would sit together, look each other in the eye, and watch their precious empire completely burn to the ground. We arrived at the Greenville estate precisely at 7 o'clock on the evening of the 24th of December. The exterior of the house was decorated with thousands of twinkling white lights, projecting the same flawless, affluent image my family had maintained for decades. But the moment Evan and I stepped into the grand dining room, the atmosphere was suffocatingly bleak. We had not driven 2 hours to share a warm holiday meal or to offer a premature reconciliation. We were there to finally drop the curtain on an exhausted, devastating play. My mother, Celeste, was desperately trying to perform her usual role as the elegant hostess, but the sheer terror radiating from her was impossible to hide. She wore a stunning crimson dress, yet her hands trembled slightly as she compulsively rearranged the linen napkins and realigned the silver cutlery. My father, Warren, sat rigidly at the head of the table. In the few months since I had last seen him, he appeared to have aged 10 years. The deep lines around his mouth and the hollow exhaustion in his eyes painted the picture of a man who realized he had handed his life's work to a phantom. Grant Ellison strutted into the dining room exactly 20 minutes late. Despite the catastrophic financial ruin closing in around him, he wore a tailored charcoal suit and an expression of supreme, unbothered confidence. He took his seat next to Sloane, completely oblivious to the fact that the room had already shifted into a tribunal. He genuinely believed he could still smooth-talk his way out of the disaster. "Warren, I know the bank is putting a little pressure on us," Grant began, casually unbuttoning his suit jacket and reaching for his water glass. "But you have to understand, modern commercial expansion requires a high tolerance for risk. Your traditional management style is a bit too conservative for the scale we are targeting. And quite frankly," he added, shooting a patronizing glance across the table at me, "having Vanessa constantly trying to personalize standard business hurdles is just muddying the waters." I did not raise my voice. I did not engage in a petty defensive argument. Instead, I unclasped my leather briefcase, pulled out a thick, meticulously bound file, and dropped it heavily onto the center of the mahogany table. "I do not personalize business," I said, my voice cutting through the room with the freezing precision of a scalpel. "I document liabilities." I opened the binder. It was arranged in strict chronological order. I did not ask for permission to speak. I simply took control of the room. I flipped to the first tab, showing my father the printed copies of my early warning emails, the ones he had completely ignored. I turned to the second tab, revealing the public court filings of Grant's previous lawsuits for unpaid vendors and broken partnerships. I moved to the third tab, exposing the convoluted corporate structure of the new limited liability company and the corresponding wire transfer receipts that proved Grant was quietly siphoning Ashmore capital through shell companies in Florida, controlled by his college friends. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the sharp rustle of the paper as I turned the pages. Grant's confident smirk instantly vanished, replaced by a pale, rigid mask of panic. He opened his mouth to interrupt, but I held up a single hand, stopping him dead. "But none of the numbers are the most damning piece of evidence in this file," I continued, my gaze shifting from Grant to my mother. "The most destructive thing you did, Grant, was not stealing the money. It was how you convinced the bank to give it to you in the first place." I turned to the final tab in the binder and slid a single sheet of paper across the polished wood until it stopped directly in front of my mother. It was a color printout of page 4 of Grant's master prospectus, the official document he had submitted to the commercial lenders to secure millions of dollars in unsecured debt. Occupying the top half of the page was the family portrait from my mother's 60th birthday. "You let him use this," I said, my voice dropping to a near whisper that echoed loudly in the silent room. "You forced my husband to step out of the frame and hold the camera. You did it to humiliate Evan, to prove that he did not belong. But by removing the only honest man from this picture and placing a con artist in the center, you handed Grant the exact tool he needed. He used this photograph to prove to the underwriters that he had the full, undisputed financial backing of the Ashmore family. This picture, the one you orchestrated to feed your own vanity, is the legal instrument he used to defraud your suppliers." Sloane let out a sharp, breathless gasp. She stared at the wire transfer receipts and the photograph, the reality of her situation finally crashing down on her, the shiny, romantic illusion shattered into a million jagged pieces. She realized, with a devastating sob, that she had never been loved or cherished by Grant. She had merely been a convenient, unlocked door into a wealthy family's vault. My father stood up from his chair. The exhaustion vanished from his face, replaced by a violent, shaking fury. He did not yell, but the sheer menace in his voice made the crystal glasses on the table vibrate. "Get out," Warren said, glaring down at Grant. "Get out of my house this second, before I call the police and have you dragged off my property." Grant scrambled to his feet. In a pathetic, desperate final maneuver, he looked toward the head of the table. "Celeste, please. You know how these corporate structures work. You know I was doing this to elevate the brand." My mother did not look at him. She was staring down at the printed photograph on the table. For the first time in her life, her impenetrable social armor cracked. She could not defend him. She could not spin the narrative. Looking at that picture, she saw the undeniable physical proof of her own toxic favoritism. She saw that her obsession with appearances had actively invited a predator into her home, and her disdain for the ordinary had driven away the only person capable of protecting them. When the heavy front doors slammed shut behind Grant, the dining room fell into a heavy, mournful silence. Sloane was quietly weeping into her hands. My father sank back into his chair, covering his face. Celeste slowly stood up. She did not look at me first. She turned her body entirely toward Evan, who had been sitting quietly by my side, watching the execution with his usual steady, unwavering calm. "Evan," she whispered, her voice breaking, completely devoid of its usual aristocratic cadence. Tears finally spilled over her perfectly powdered cheeks. "I am so deeply sorry. I treated you like an outsider because I was too foolish to understand what real substance looked like. I stripped you of your place in this family, and I have never been more wrong in my entire life." She then turned her tear-filled eyes toward me. "Vanessa, I forced you to choose between the family you were born into and the family you built. I valued an image over loyalty, and it cost us everything. Please forgive me." I looked at my mother. I did not offer her a warm embrace. I did not cry tears of immediate reconciliation. Forgiveness is a process, not a sudden event, and I was no longer the girl who accepted apologies just to keep the peace. "I will help Dad coordinate with the forensic accountants and the legal team to salvage the company," I said, my tone remaining strictly professional. "But I have 3 absolute conditions. First, every single legal and financial document from this day forward goes through an independent, retained advisor. Second, Grant Ellison's name is completely eradicated from every facet of this family. And third, if I ever, for a single second, feel that Evan is being treated as anything less than the most respected member of this family, we will walk out the door and we will never come back." My father nodded vigorously. My mother simply whispered her agreement, wiping her face with a linen napkin. An hour later, before we sat down to eat a dinner that had grown completely cold, my father pulled a heavy digital camera out of a cabinet in the hallway. He set up a metal tripod at the base of the grand staircase. "We need a new picture," Warren said quietly. He set the automatic timer for 10 seconds and rushed to take his place in the center of the group. No one was ordered to hold the camera. No one was pushed to the side. I stood next to my father, and Evan stood firmly next to me, his arm wrapped warmly around my waist. He was not standing there because he had finally been granted permission. He was standing there because they had finally realized it was exactly where he had always belonged. I looked directly at the glass lens as the red light on the camera blinked rapidly. A camera does not know how to lie. It does not care about your bank account or your social status. It only freezes a single moment in time, exposing exactly who is brave enough to stay in the frame and who ultimately has to pay the devastating price for trying to erase them. The flash erupted, bright and blinding, capturing the truth exactly as it was. Thank you so much for listening to my story today. I would love to know where you are tuning in from, so please drop your city or country in the comments below so we can connect. If you enjoyed this journey, please make sure to subscribe to the Helena Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and hit the hype button to help this story reach even more people who might need to hear it.